Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Smallville Season 1, Episodes 15 and 16. So, for Episode 15, we have Chloe at one point going on and asking people what they most desire. And immediately when I heard that, I'm like, this reminds me of Lucifer. Because, of course, we would go on and have Lucifer ask everybody, what is your deepest desire? And eventually they would spill the beans immediately. And I think I'm only talking really about Lucifer, of course, because Tom Welling, in the later seasons, was to eventually be on Lucifer as the villain character, which was actually really good. I had a lot of fun watching that show, specifically to see, like, Tom Welling be part of that show. So, but let's episode 15 probably has to hands down be probably one of my favorite episodes in this season so far. And that's interesting because there's also the pilot. The pilot actually was pretty good. And there also was episodes ago of the whole Parasite episode, which I like that also. But I just feel that, like, overall, I just really enjoy, like, performance-wise from everybody, just, like, really giving us their best within these episodes. And plus also, it doesn't hurt that Lana is to, of course, go on and do the whole pool scene of which that she is to go on and do. Yeah. Everything is working out. But also here's the turnaround. So episode 15 is great. I thoroughly enjoy it. Even though it has that goofy flower, the Nicodemus, I believe is how it's called. Yeah, Nicodemus. And they end up spending so much time on the name of this flower that they end up having to go on and title it Nicodemus, the episode. And I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. So, but now we get into episode 16, and I honestly feel like episode 16 feels like a filler episode. Just kill time, just burning out. Like, there's nothing within this episode where I'm like, great, like, this exists. The only thing that could really have come out of this is the whole Warrior Angel thing. Like, this is the first appearance of Warrior Angel, and if you guys don't know, we have Lex who has to go on and on about within this series at some point him being a Warrior Angel fan, to the point where I think he ends up showcasing his massive collection at some point that's not in this episode, but at some point elsewhere, that Lex is to be this Warrior Angel fan. To the point where I think somewhere later on in the show, they end up doing a Warrior Angel movie, which I thought was funny, for the show. So, this Warrior Angel character that they have this comic book for, they'll definitely keep using this character, and so, like, I thought that was kind of like this fun little, like, meta kind of thing, where we have, like, a comic book character that they did for the show, and this technically, the origin of this whole thing is that this is to be from a comic book slightly. It is to be certain characters and certain names and stuff like that. So, with that said, we also end up getting, by the tail end of episode 16, if I don't really like the episode at all, to the point where I'm thinking, like, still, like, 6 has to be the worst episode that I've possibly seen so far. Just, it doesn't work for me. And And I don't know what it is about 6s, but 16 is kind of like the runner-up for that. Like, 6 still has to be the worst episode, but 16 is just... It's getting close, because it just feels like there's so much time that it's just... Like, what are we doing here? But by the end of episode 16, we go on and, of course, do a Superman song by the end of the episode. It's not easy to be me. That whole song ends, or not the whole song, but that song ends up getting put by the end of episode 16. So, yeah. So we actually have a Superman song being used in the show, unless there was another Superman song that kind of slipped somewhere. I'm kind of wondering if Daughtry's song, Waiting for Superman, was ever to have gotten used in some other Superman show. That would have actually been really cool to have a Daughtry song about Superman, that being used. Especially because Daughtry actually is a comic book fan, and he is to have also gone on and done a number of comic book covers. You can probably Google it and research it and whatever, but yeah, he's gone on and done some artwork for comic books, legitimately artwork for comic books. So I want Daughtry's Superman song to eventually be used, because I like that song anyways. And plus also, like, I'm kind of curious if Kryptonite ever gets used in the show. The one Three Doors Down song, I'm sure it probably does somewhere. It'll be cool to watch one of these episodes to figure that out. I'm not quite sure, because it's been such a long time since I've seen Dukes of Hazzard. I think that they end up also using the Dukes of Hazzard theme song in this show for when Jonathan is kind of driving around. I think they end up kind of slipping that in, because of course in this episode anyways we have Jonathan who is to give us an amazing just performance in episodes 15, as well as just a lot of other people. So hopefully I'll be able to go on and talk about that and get to all that, because there's a lot to talk about in 15, and then 16 is like, wow, this is a victory lap. There's not much going on in this episode. Not really. So, with that said, let's just go on into it. So what happens is, for episode 15, we have a flower called the Nicodemus that is to release this this powder, or this krypton. I'm assuming this kryptonite-like power, and it is to make people go on and have them be out of character. This, of course, is to be a very old flower that I guess at some point in some old book they had figured out the antidote for, and conveniently they end up finding that out by the time of which we start having certain people start dropping like flies here. But in between that, we of course have Clark, who is trying to go on and stop all these people from raging out, killing, shooting, or being in a pool at some point in their lives. So with that said, yeah, like, episode 15, oh my god, it's so good. People need to see it. It is so good. So let's go on and talk about episode 16. What ends up happening in episode 16. So, we have a kid named Ryan who is to have this ability to read people's thoughts. Hence why this episode's boring. So, Ryan is to go on and eventually escape from his father and his lover, and Ryan then goes on to I think at some point get basically run over by Martha, but it seems like the kid is okay. So it seems that Martha goes on and takes this kid into the Kent home, and so it seems that Ryan is to pretend, or pretended to have amnesia, so he can just kind of continue to enjoy the time that he has with these people and not have to tell them the truth about what had really happened to him. So Ryan is to realize that it seems that Clark is to somehow block Ryan from reading his thoughts. And come to find out, like, we have characters in the DC world like Superman or like Batman who can't go on and be like kind of psychically broken at some points, and that ends up getting like written into comic books for certain scenarios that end up getting of course to be like put through to just like, oh, okay, well, like Clark's weakness is still magic, but anyways. So Ryan eventually has to, at some point, tell the Kent family the truth that his father is coming after him, and so eventually that leads to Ryan running away because his parents are to re-find Ryan and want to use him again to go on and try to steal from Lex. We also, in episode 16, end up having Lex talking about his brother Julian and how Lionel, of course, was to actually be happy at that one period of time, and Lex was to realize having this brother was to go on and give Lex this real slice of family, and eventually what ends up happening to Julian then is to have Lex go on and lose all of that and have really both Lionel and Lex be at odds with one another. To where I honestly can't wait to the one episode where Lex does go on into the psych ward, because we end up kind of peeling back that story a little bit more. To where, of course, Lex is to go on and consistently be rocking back and forth this baby, and is to consistently call it Julian, but it's like not a real baby at some point. Spoilers for those of you who haven't seen certain episodes, but I'm sure by the time that I get to them, like, no one will probably remember what I said here, because that's probably what will happen. So with that said, very kind of episode 16 really is. We also have an interesting thing going on with Pete in episode 15. We get some backstory on Pete in episode 15, so I thought that was like, ooh, wow, like, this is cool. So yeah, let's go on into the double 5 time territory. I think it's about that time to just go on into spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil these episodes. So in the beginning of episode 15, I'm so excited to just talk about this. It's weird. So we have a character named James Beals, who's played by Bill Mondi here. And the interesting thing about Bill is that he went on and he was to be in Blade, the series, the live action Blade series. And I was like, oh, okay, so yeah, so maybe him being on the show might have had that work out for him. Not quite sure about the timeline of things, but anyways. So, but this character, James Beals, is to have quite a bit of rage, and he is kind of taking it out on the road, so to speak, where we have James that is going on and is honking his horn consistently as we of course have Jonathan who is kind of going the speed limit and is seeing James behind him. He's like, hey man, what's the hurry? Where's the fire, so to speak. So that's not exactly what he says, but I'm paraphrasing. So James is consistently, desperately trying to get around this guy because James is calling Lionel, trying to go on and need Lionel's expertise about this flower. And so James is kind of all over the place on the road. He's driving like a madman to the point of James driving himself off of the road, and he ends up kind of flipping his car. Jonathan goes out to scramble to get to James to have Jonathan then hit with this flower, which I don't think it has like kryptonite in it, so I think it's just a flower that just seems unusual. The Nicodemus. That sweet Nicodemus. That sweet delish of Nicodemus. Anyways, I'm being goofy. So we end up getting intro, and so come to find out, Kent is to go on and make his way to the house to go on and find out that Jonathan, of course, had saved the day, and it wasn't Clark this time around. And Clark is to go on and see his father, and all of a sudden, Jonathan and Martha are to go on and start locking lips and start to get intimate, and Clark is to turn around and like, yeah, I didn't want to see that between my folks. That's a little too much information for me to go on and see. But so we also had Lex and Dr. Hamilton, and Dr. Hamilton goes on and talks to Lex about James, who is to go on and take this flower, and eventually must have experienced the effects because this guy was driven off the road into an accident and had to have been saved by somebody. And Lex is to go on and ask Dr. Hamilton, and it's like, well, like, it wasn't Clark Kent, was it? And Dr. Hamilton goes, no, it's actually his father, Jonathan Kent. So we have Clark that is to see his father be fairly unusual, because Jonathan is to, of course, have certain chores, because he needs to do some stuff in the farm, the barn, and Jonathan is to want to do anything but. Jonathan is to push all of his chores upon Clark to just say, like, hey, Clark, like, you got this, right? You can get all the chores done in 5 minutes. Just take another 5 and get all of Jonathan's chores done today. So Jonathan is to get this beer and break it and open it. And he's like, yeah, like, whoa, this beer's really pouring out. So Lex is to make his way to the Kents, like, oh, hey there. So Lex goes on and talks to Jonathan, and it's to say, like, yeah, I heard about the accident, and so, like, hey, if anything happened, like, I'm more than willing to take care of it. And Jonathan is to say to Lex, it's like, oh, you just don't want me to sue you. Which I would honestly, at this point, love to do. And so Martha and Ken is like, well, hey, like, he's just being nice. Like, Lex is just being nice. It's like, just kind of... And Jonathan ends up saying, like, the worst possible thing that he can end up going on and saying to Lex, and also Lex's dad, and how, like, he just wants them to just kind of go away, and that'll be, like, the best day that he's ever had kind of thing. So Lex leaves and just like, oh, like I was trying to do something nice, but like Jonathan, like there's something about him today. So Jonathan is to mention to Clark and Martha that he wants to go and take a nap. And they're like, man, he's just very unusual today. Like Jonathan is just like he's his own man today. So we have Clark that goes on to school, and that's where, of course, Chloe uh, is to get guidance from the principal to say that she needs to really get to really the pulse of the students, like what they really want, like what they really want to see from this newspaper, I guess. So Chloe is to go on and ask everybody what their desire is. And so both Clark and Pete are walking to meet up with Chloe, and Pete is to go on and talk about um, that at one point Pete's dad had kind of gotten run out of business from Lex, and I was like, okay, that's interesting to kind of play around with. And so we have Clark that eventually meets up with Chloe, and so we end up finding out that Lana's most desire is that she wants to go onto the top of the windmill of Smallville. And I remembered something about Lana and a windmill, but I didn't remember what it was. And I guess this might have been that, but I also was to think that there was something else going on with that windmill with Lana. Maybe they end up bringing it back up into the show. I'm not quite sure, but this, I guess, is to be the first thing about the whole windmill. So Lana ends up talking about wanting to climb up there and see the town from where she sits, because I guess if you go on and you stand there, you can see everything. And so now Chloe is to ask Clark, it's like, well, hey, like, what do you think that you want to do, Clark? And Clark is looking at Lana and like, ugh. And Chloe's like, could you keep it like PG here, Clark? Because like everybody that has gone on and I've asked them this, it's always either something like it's always something like violent, or it's something like romantic or something like that. And so Clark doesn't have anything really, even when Chloe is to be asking him. And so, because really Clark is to be a one-track mind um, around Lana, it seems. And he's so smitten with her. But so pushing on. So we go on and we have Jonathan, who eventually is to wake up from his slumber. And he is, of course, getting a call from this bank loan stating that they cannot go on and loan him this money anymore. And so Clark eventually is to meet up with Jonathan, as Jonathan had answered this call from this loan people, and is to say, it's like, well, hey, I'm going to meet you in person because I want you to refuse my loan to my face. To where it's like, okay, where is Jonathan then going to get the loan for this farm then? Is he going to go on and finally like talk to Lex and just be like, hey man, like whatever I said episodes before, like I'm sorry, but now I need your help because I'm wondering when that's going to happen. And so Jonathan is to drive like only Jonathan can because of Dukes of Hazzard But anyway, so Jonathan is going on, and he is like swerving and all this stuff. And of course, like, we have John who's doing his own stunts here, because of course he is. Because like Jonathan had been amazing in Dukes of Hazzard, anyways. So, but anyways, so John goes and does this swerve, and then like this other swerve, and Clark is noticing his father drive very unusually, and him cussing people out on the road. And so Clark finds where his father is, and is to realize that Jonathan is to be wielding the shotgun. And Clark is like, "Dad, what are you doing?" And Jonathan is to want to go on into this bank and fire this gun. And so instead, Clark stops his father and tries to grab the barrel of the shotgun, which just leads Jonathan to fire upon Clark, killing his son. And then the credits roll in the show, and the show's canceled. It's over. No, if we've already had in an episode before where Clark had been pelted with bullets, why do we have to go on again episodes later and show that Clark has bullets bounce off him with shotgun shells? Like, as if they're trying to go on and say here, like, yeah, Clark is really durable. Clark can, like, there's no weapon that is going to make Clark bend the knee, so to speak. So Jonathan, after shooting Clark, is to all of a sudden just be like, and then he falls over. And so Clark needs to take his dad to the hospital. And so eventually they go on to find that James, the first, the patient zero guy, is to be in a coma. And it seems that Jonathan will slowly but surely head in that same direction also, until someone can figure out a cure. So we have both Chloe and Lana going off to the site that this accident had happened. And so they're trying to figure out what could have possibly caused this accident. And so both Chloe and Lana get to this location where Lana is to get hit with this flower. But it seemed that Lana was sneezing a couple times. Does Lana have flower allergies? That's kind of interesting to play with. And wouldn't that also be weird if Lana did have some kind of flower allergy of sorts, when Lana's stepmother, Nels, was to, of course, be in a flower shop business? And we didn't see Lana sneeze or anything like that before, giving us this notion that Lana may have allergies. I don't know. But anyways, so we're going to see some interesting things going on with Lana in this episode anyways. And so we'll get there right here and now. So Lana, the very next day, is to go on with an entirely changed wardrobe and is to make her way into school. And now we end up seeing Whitney with a pilot haircut. I say pilot haircut because we had Whitney who had a certain haircut in the pilot, but then all of a sudden, the very next day, Whitney had this kind of like longer haircut that he's probably much more known for. But now we're back to pilot haircut, so I'm just very confused. I'm very confused what Whitney is doing here with his hair. It doesn't matter, but still, it does. So we get a moment where, like, and it's sad that kind of Whitney is kind of barely in this episode also. And so, and because all he's here to do is just get broken up by Lana, I don't think that was said correctly or said right, but we'll talk about it here. So Whitney goes on and meets up with Lana, and Lana doesn't go on and mention Whitney's haircut. How could she have not have? Anyways, so Lana is talking to Whitney, and so since Whitney won't go on and kind of ditch class to be with her, immediately we have Lana who's say it's like, well, you know what, Whitney? Like, I think I'm done with you. Like, I think we're done. So Lana goes on to eventually meet up with Clark, and both Clark and Lana sneak away to go to this pool, and Clark is to tell Lana that they probably should not be in here because there might be some trouble that is to happen with them being here. It's unlawful. So Lana is to start going ahead and relieving herself of her clothes, and Clark is to look on like, and kind of cringe, but also look at my face and what I did there. That was pretty cringe also. So Clark is to just be all wide-eyed and like, yeah, I'm seeing some of that Lana. And so we have Lana who goes on into her unders, and is to splash upon this water. And then we get a moment where Lana is to grab Clark and put him into this pool. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, with Clark being as strong as he is, shouldn't Lana not have been able to easily dunk him into this pool? I think it was also interesting when Michael Rosenbaum and Tom Welling were both talking for like ideas for the season. They were kind of wondering how heavy Clark should be, or like meaning like should Clark be heavier than what he actually weighs because he's a Kryptonian. Like, and I was like, okay, well, if he has super strength, why does he need to go on and have to like weigh a certain, like, as if you go on to certain other planets, on certain planets, you end up weighing different things, come to find out. And I think that's why they probably had that idea, but then kind of went on and just kind of scrapped it. But that is kind of an interesting thing when you have like an alien that is to go on to a different planet and he weighs differently. That's kind of an interesting idea to have played around with. So we push on. So we have Lana that is to further go on, because heaven forbid, I think there's probably another Chloe moment in between these scenes, but heaven forbid I even know what that scene really is about. But anyways, so Lana is to go on and eventually meet up with Lex. And so at the Talon, we of course go on to have Lana that is very much being pushy and being out of character. And so when Lana is talking to this girl and mentioning that they don't think that they probably have someone to cover this shift, and Lana is to mention it's like, well, hey, then everybody, we're just going to close early. And Lex is to be like, well, I think the Talon closes at 9. And Lana is to Lex, it's like, well, like the only reason why you kept the Talon open was because of me, because I basically persuaded you to keep this open. And Lana is kind of pushing on Lex to just say, maybe I need a more experienced man, an older man to... And Lex is just like, no. And so Lana is to go on and take Lex's car and kind of push Lex away. And so Lana is driving off, and Clark is to spot Lana and be like, hey, Lana's driving Lex's car? This is unusual. So Clark super speeds to find out where Lana is heading, and of course she's heading to the windmill. Lana starts climbing her way up this windmill, and all of a sudden she is to start falling backwards, and of course Clark is to grab her, rescue her, another save for the day, and so Lana is to go on and pass out and be another victim to the Nicodemus flower, sadly enough. So we go on here, and we have at some point where Chloe and Pete are to make their way to this flower within Dr. Hamilton's lab. And eventually Pete ends up getting doused with this flower as they go on to kind of look at Dr. Hamilton's experiments. And so we come to find out that Pete is going to get infected here. We also had a moment where when Lex is to ask Dr. Hamilton whether or not that these flowers are dangerous, and if they aren't, then Lex is just going to have a big whiff of these flowers. And so Lex is to go on and say that, like, Dr. Hamilton is to not be doing what Lex wanted, as Lex is just to be focusing on the meteorites, and Dr. Hamilton is much more focusing on some flower project. So eventually Lex takes down Dr. Hamilton's experiment and is to go on to have him in Cadmus Labs. We also had Chloe that was to look at the tape of her and Lana being where they were by that accident, and come to find out, Chloe was to realize that Dr. Hamilton was also there in the same location they were. So we have Chloe who wants to go on and look into Dr. Hamilton's lab to see if there's any connection to what happened to possibly Lana or any number of these people, and Dr. Hamilton might be the cause of all this. So we go on here, and so Pete is to go on and want to seek out revenge for his father, but not only that, Pete is to, of course, be jealous of Clark and Lex's relationship, to the point it seems that even Clark is to find that out with this episode, that it seems that the more that Clark is spending time with Lex, the more Pete is realizing that, like, they don't get to spend as much time together. And so we have, of course, Pete making his way to the Luther Mansion, as I like to say it. And Pete is wheeling a gun around. And Pete, of course, is to see both Dr. Hamilton and Lex, and they are, of course, now talking about a cure. Because, of course, we have a moment when Clark is with Martha, and they're starting to realize that Jonathan is starting to slip into this coma, and Martha goes on and explains to Clark about the time that both her and Jonathan met, and how it was all about these class notes. And so Martha was to ask Jonathan about these notes for this class, and Jonathan didn't realize that Martha was actually the note taker for that class. And so Martha ends up borrowing Jonathan's notebook, and Martha is to say to Jonathan, it's like, well, hey, like, are you sure you want me to take this notebook? And Jonathan ends up saying, it's like, well, hey, like I'll trust that you'll bring it back to me. And so Martha was to say, like, after that moment, she realized that she wanted Jonathan to marry her. And even years after that, it seems that like she still always clings on to that memory and that thought of Jonathan marrying her and being with her. And Lex is to kind of comfort Martha after, of course, Clark is to then go on and meet with Chloe to say where Pete had headed, and so on and so forth, and that he was being out of character and unusual. So Pete is now with Dr. Hamilton and Lex, and so what ends up happening is that this book ends up being dropped into this fire, and so Lex is going on and telling Pete, it's like, well, hey, I'm going to go after this book in this fire. Like, you can shoot me if you want, but I'm going to get this book. And so Dr. Hamilton ends up going on and using this poker to slam Pete's hand down, and Dr. Hamilton runs off. And so Lex tosses Dr. Hamilton the book and says, like, go, go, go. So Lex is now have this gun by him, possibly going to die. And so Lex does, and then the credits roll. Man, everybody's dying in this episode. What's going on? So Clark ends up showing up at the mansion to go on and take Lex and to toss him against this wall, to have Lex get knocked out here temporarily. And then Clark is to go on and take the gun from Pete's hand and then bop him on the head, knocking him out. And so now Lex ends up coming to, asking Clark, it's like, well, hey, like, what do they feed you there, Clark? What do they feed you on this farm? And Clark is just like, So they now realize that Pete is going to be yet another one of these patients. So they go on and they figure out the cure. And so, come to find out, we, of course, have Jonathan, who is to come to find out that he is to be better. He's coming out of this. And we have, like, the Kent family that is all kind of hugging together and so on and so forth. But we also had so many moments in this episode where Jonathan was kind of hungering after Martha. Hungering, that sounds like a weird term, but like trying to get with Martha, and I thought that was kind of funny in this episode. But then we again have another time where Lex is to look on as this perfect family, and Lex is just like, I want that. Why can't I just have that? And so by the end of this episode, we now have both Lana and Clark that are both at the windmill looking out on the town. And so Lana is asking Clark if there was anything that she had gone on and done that seemed like way out of line or anything like that. And Clark is just be giggling and like, and he's like, no. So Lana's like, you're telling me the truth, are you, Clark? And Clark is just like, ah. So yeah, so I think that was like a real fun episode, um, for this one. So now let's go on into the next episode. So now we have to go on and cover this. Okay, great. Uh, I don't like this episode. I just don't. So the next episode, episode 16, which of course I don't know the title of, but I think it's called The Stray, or Stray is, I think, the episode name. So, goofy title for a goofy concept. So, we have Ryan that has his two parents who are both James and Deborah here, I believe. And so both of them are going on and having Ryan go to this pawn shop to have this angel to be pawned, and supposedly the angel is to be a fake. It's what the pawn shop owner is to say. It's like, well, Ryan is to mention that that is the last thing that his mother was to give to him, and the pawn shop owner is like, well, how about I give you $60? And the kid's like, oh, okay, that sounds like a reasonable thing to do. So we have the pawn shop owner who's going into the safe, and he's adjusting and trying to get this thing open. So Ryan, after getting that transaction, goes back to his parents to go on and tell them what the combination of the safe is, so both of these parents can go on and go into this pawn shop and rob this pawn shop. And so what ends up happening, we of course have James, who goes on and shoots the guy in the pawn shop. Ryan is to be mortified by this happening, and so he runs off to eventually get run over by Martha, and supposedly Brian has amnesia after that moment. So, and I think the tunnel screen opens after that. So we go on into this episode, and like all the photos for this one looks very generic, and I have no idea what's really going on here. Isn't that great? That really helps. All of the things that I'm just like, what now? Who did the what now in this one? So we have Ryan going on and eventually having nowhere really to go for Ryan to be. And so Martha's like, well, hey, how about I just bring him home to my place? And then eventually social services can go on and collect him and then find the right home for him. So they're like, okay, yeah, that's great. Like, go on and do that. So Martha goes on and brings Ryan home to eventually have this kid go on and like make Clark's family breakfast, and it's, you know, like the perfect breakfast to go on and give them. And then all of a sudden Clark goes down there and he starts eating like pancakes, as Ryan is to not know exactly what the perfect thing he can go on to do to eventually know what Clark wants, because there's a reason for that. So we have Ryan, who eventually is to go on and play basketball with Clark, and we have Martha and Jonathan looking on and stating that it's like, well, hey, like, maybe it was a mistake for us to not have like another brother or another sibling for Clark, and like maybe Clark needs somebody that he can like share his secret with, and like maybe Clark does need another brother, another sibling. And so Jonathan and Martha are talking about that as we have Clark and Ryan who are going and shooting these shots, and we have Clark going on and telling Ryan here that he's only going to get one more, and then right after that, the scene stops, and I was like, okay, it seems like there's some moments here where we can go on and realize that like they're gonna cut at some point. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe at some point Tom didn't realize like the audio would be playing at that scene or whatever. But yeah, they end up going right to Tom as he says like, yeah, you're gonna get one more shot, and then they cut the scene, and I thought that that was funny. So we have at some point where Ryan is to eventually meet up with Lex. To where, of course, when Ryan is to talk to Lex, it seems we find out that Lex is to be this big Warrior Angel fan, and that Lex is to have this like mint condition #1, and Ryan kind of cuts Lex off and is to say like, yeah, I know that you have this comic book, and Lex is like, well, how did you figure that out? And Ryan is to say, it's like, well, because you're rich, and of course you do, but also because Ryan is a mind reader. So we, man, this episode is tough. So this episode is so tough. So we eventually have Ryan at some point in this episode going and telling Lana that the waitress that is being the Talon is to not be that good and that she should be fired. And Lana is to go on and ask Ryan, it's like, well, like, why? And Ryan is to say, it's like, well, it's because it's my secret. As well as Ryan is to go on and ask Lana about like about her secrets, and Lana's like, well, if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret then. So speaking of secrets, we also go on to have Martha, who is cutting up these apples to get ready for this meal. And so we have Ryan going on and consistently talking about Clark, and because at some point Ryan is to try to hide away from his dad, because Ryan senses that his dad was in the Talon, and so Ryan tries to run off, and he goes into this dumpster, and Clark ends up having to rescue Ryan from this dumpster as it's going on and getting emptied into this this garbage truck. And so Ryan ends up, or Clark ends up peeling away this dumpster to eventually tell Ryan that it's like everything's okay, you're safe, and welcome to Smallville. That was the pilot thing, but now we have like Clark who doesn't go on and say that again. But I thought that would have been funny. That would have been a callback to the pilot. So, but yeah, so we end up going on to eventually Ryan talks to Martha and is to continue to just kind of talk about Clark. And so eventually Martha's brain ends up going into talking about Clark's secret. And so Ryan goes on to find this out himself. And Clark ends up going on to realize that Ryan is to know Clark's secret. But Ryan is to go on and say, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm not going to tell anybody. Because when really looking at it, Ryan is to always seem that he is to be weird also, and weirded out by people. And so, like, he feels very, like, this, very much the same with Clark. And Ryan, while Clark and him were playing basketball, Ryan is to say that he likes being around Clark because it's so quiet, because Ryan can't hear Clark's thoughts. Whenever he's around other people, like, he ends up kind of getting bombarded by all these thoughts. So we go on and we have Clark, who is to go on with Chloe to make it to the spot where Ryan had got into an accident with Martha's car. And so Clark is to go on and find this backpack and find these items in it, and is to find this photo. And so I guess maybe Clark is to justify his x-ray vision to Chloe. And so I guess at one point, while Ryan was with Chloe talking to her, Ryan had mentioned to Clark that evidently Chloe really likes Clark and wants to go on and ask if she will come, or she will go to prom with him, and that she's already picked out a dress and it's pink. Clark doesn't think that that's right, because of course Clark thinks Chloe doesn't wear dresses. But then eventually, when Clark is to confront Chloe and ask about the whole like prom and dress thing, Chloe's just be like, oh my god, yeah, like, that's absolutely true. And Clark is just like, okay, alright. So this guy can read minds somehow. So we also in this episode have Lionel coming back and talking to Lex. And so Lionel in this episode is talking to Lex and mentioning that Lex is doing so well as far as working in the crab factory that Lionel wants to go on and kind of like promote Lex to have him come back to Metropolis, because that's what Lex has always ever wanted anyways. And so Lex is just to be back and forthing about going. And so eventually, by the end of this episode, Lex is very tempted to take his father up on the offer, and is to go on and give Clark this sword, which is this foil, to be as like a going away gift. And Lex is possibly thinking about taking his father up on this offer, but I just think that was like kind of so funny how Clark is consistently like swiping the sword. And so we have Ryan that eventually is to realize that his parents are coming for him. And so we have at one point where James is to make his way to this hospital to say that he wants information on where Ryan is, because he is this detective or private investigator that's working on this case to find this kid for Ryan's biological parents. And so his doctor is like, oh, good, then I have to go on and I need to ask you questions. So both of these parents are going on like, well, I don't want to answer any of these questions from this nurse, so let's skedaddle and let's hope that we can find Ryan again. So we of course eventually have here where Ryan is to come to find out that his mother is to find him, and is to say like, okay, we're gonna get you out of here, and we're gonna keep going on and doing what we're doing. And the whole next scheme is to go after Lex. So from what I remember, I thought Ryan for some reason was to die in this show. As if his power was somehow going to be too much, and like he ends up dying. That's what I thought somehow happened in this show. Um, but we don't actually see him die. We just get this kind of like the tail end of this episode where like his nose starts to bleed and then he dies. That's what I thought happened by this episode. But maybe that's in another episode where he comes back. I don't know. I just thought that was odd to me, from what I remember about characters. So we have this woman scooping him up, and so Clark wanted to go on and say goodbye, and Jonathan was to tell Clark, it's like, well, I'm sorry, like, they had to take this kid and take him quickly, so, because they were busy, and so the kid ends up be taken by his parents, and is to be put into this limo where they're driving their way to get Lex. And so Lex goes on into this limo to find out that he is to be like held up, to need to give them this password, to get information. And so we have James who's asking Ryan, it's like, well, hey, do you know the password? And Ryan ends up saying yes. So they end up dumping Lex off of the street or off on some road somewhere, and they end up making their way to this location, to this bowling alley, where James is trying to decipher what the password is, because Ryan ends up just saying Julian, and that actually isn't the password. So now James is upset with Ryan and is like, well, hey, what is really the password? And so Ryan is to turn to Deborah and is to tell her, it's like, well, hey, once he gets the password, he's going to kill you, Deborah. And Deborah's like, well, hey, like, you know what, this kid is a lot of things, but I don't think that he's a liar. And James goes on and turns the gun on Deborah and is to shoot her and kill her here. So I'm kind of wondering if I said anything about the Warrior Angel, because the Warrior Angel is going to be a consistent running thing here. If I didn't say this, or if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. Warrior Angel. This is a comic book that Lex is to be such a fan of that at some point we end up seeing the Warrior Angel complete collection of Lex. And even at some point we have Warrior Angel being made as a movie at some point in the later seasons of the show. To the point where I think Lex ends up having to be one of the stars' bodyguards on the show, because they find out the safest places to be with Clark. I think is how that episode ends up playing out. So, anyways, but I just wanted to get that out. So we have Ryan, who runs off to this bowling alley to hide himself, and this bowling alley seems to be closed, and so James is to follow Ryan at his bowling alley to throw the bowling ball into the perfect lane that, of course, Ryan is in. And so eventually James makes his way to find where Ryan is in this behind this bowling alley, behind these lanes in the bowling alley. And so Clark eventually puts the pieces together of what had happened, tracking this vehicle to then go on and find that Ryan is in danger. And so Clark ends up taking this bowling ball and chucking it so hard that it goes through this wall to hit James here, knocks him out, and is to eventually save Ryan. And so Ryan ends up going to the legitimate social worker people and is to go on and have them find out that he has some aunt that they can go on and have him go there and have him be adopted by this woman and it'll all work out. So Lana is to tell Ryan that he was right about the whole, like, that girl being like the wrong employee and that she did fire her. And Lana ends up kissing Ryan, and Ryan ends up getting so much on cloud nine that he's to be like sitting in this chair at this table. So is Clark, and Ryan ends up saying that he's in love, and Clark is like, "Well, hey man, get in line." Like, I saw her first, even though technically Whitney saw her first. Still, Clark is to see her first as far as like not already having um, been claimed by Whitney. So by the end of the episode, we now really just have like Ryan going and saying goodbye to the Kent family, because of course Ryan is going on to eventually go off with his aunt, and it seems that everything is going to go on and work out for these characters. As far as just getting rid of this character for this episode, Ryan, and going on, and yeah, like for this episode, I didn't remember as much stuff as I would have, because like this episode just really like didn't matter to me. I just didn't like it, and so really like there were so many times where I was just like, yeah, I don't remember much about this one because I just didn't like it. Um, but I think we also had a moment where Clark was talking to Lex and kind of mentioning about Ryan, how Lex is to mention to Clark about him going off to possibly be leaving Smallville, and Clark is to say, it's like, well, hey, did Ryan tell you that? And Lex is like, no, I haven't told anybody. I'm just telling you now. And so eventually we get to where Clark is to go on to be like, man, like, this kid knows everything about everybody and like knows everything about him, and like as if he's like I think Chloe summarizes it as him, maybe he's a fortune teller, or maybe he called Chloe the call me now get a free reading woman. uh they're really calling for the times on that one. But so yeah, with that said, yeah, I think that is to call it a wrap here. Kind of trying to remember anything that I had probably forgotten to have mentioned within this review, and I think it's fine enough. Like, again, episode 16 is such a filler episode. So is. But I get it, you also need to tie in a kid to an episode also, and that ends up being this episode, is to just tie in a kid. Um, as of like the last episode kind of being this more uh, kind of scandalous episode with Lana going on and revealing all. Not all, but you know. Anyways, so with that said, I'm going to go on and get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.